So, good evening, everyone, and a really, really warm welcome. My name is Axel Ruger. I'm the Anna Maria and Stephen Callan Director of the Frick Collection, and it's great to see so many of you here to tonight's lecture in the Stephen A. Schwarzman Auditorium here at the Frick Collection. I would just want to say, also point out to you that you please put your phones on silence. The other day we had a concert here, and halfway through the concert Schubert was augmented by Apple, as it were, so that still does happen sometimes. It is, of course, an enormous pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who is well known, I'm sure, to most of you who are here, if not to all of you, Xavier F. Salomon, our Deputy Director, and Peter J. Sharp, Curator, who is going to lecture tonight on his most recent exhibition, To the Holy Sepulcher, Treasures from the Terra Sancta Museum, which just opened in our new Ronald S. Lauder exhibition galleries. And the exhibition really is spectacular, even if I say so myself. I can also say so because I had nothing to do with the planning of it. But it is such a unique opportunity, and Xavier will, of course, explain that in much greater detail, how special all these objects are that have, ironically, in possibly one of the most difficult environments one can imagine in the world, survived over all these many centuries, when similar objects of that kind in Europe have been victim to wars across the continent, religious wars, other catastrophes, earthquakes, and so forth, so that many of these objects are so special and so unique, really, that they have survived in the treasury of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And there is a lot that will be revealed to you over the course of the lecture on this material. Xavier does not need any introduction, I'm sure, to most of you, but of course, in his time here, he has overseen too many exhibitions to mention, too many other activities, and then most recently, of course, the renovation and redevelopment of the Frick Collection, and in particular, of course, also the reinstallation of the permanent collection. Many of you will also have enjoyed Xavier and some of our other colleagues over cocktails with the Curator, the renovation series. And Xavier has also been the author of many publications and books. And with regards to exhibitions, of course, I just mentioned To the Holy Sepulcher. Recent exhibitions also include Nicolas Patti and Rosalba Carriera, and Tiepolo in Milan, the latter one in 2019. And also I should point out to you, for those of you who have not been through the museum yet, that Xavier was also responsible for the beautiful installation we have of Flora Juknovic's Four Seasons, based on our series of paintings by François Boucher. Xavier has, before he came to the Met, to the Frick, worked at the Met and the Dulwich Picture Gallery, and holds his many degrees from the Courtauld Institute in London. And he is also a man who has been decorated on numerous occasions, one of them being the Cavaliere dell'Ordine della Stella d'Italia in 2018. And then last Saturday, actually, he received the Order of Merit of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre, which I think he is proudly wearing today. So that I will say, though, in closing, that this is also a slightly bittersweet moment, because Xavier, this is going to be, at least in this format, the last lecture Xavier is going to give in his current role as Deputy Director and Chief Curator, because in a few weeks' time he's going to leave us and move on to a new challenge, being then the director of the Calouste Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. So enjoy, Xavier, while it lasts here, and with that I will hand over the lectern, and please welcome Xavier Salomon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see so many of you here this evening. The plan for this evening is to bring you to the Holy Sepulcher. The exhibition has, the title of the exhibition is To the Holy Sepulcher, because there is this idea of pilgrimages to the Holy Sepulcher and the fact that so many of the objects in the exhibition, or most of them, were given by Catholic sovereigns or states to the Holy Sepulcher, so this idea of going there. Now, what I would like to do this evening is not so much talk about all the objects. You can look at them in the exhibition, read the labels, read the catalog, but give you the two contexts around it. One is how the exhibition came about and the journey that brought this exhibition here to the Frick over the past few years, and a broader context on the Holy Sepulcher and how these objects were used and how the site is important to understand these objects. Now, the whole project began in a very unlikely place. This is the Cercle de l'Union Interalliée on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris, and not a place where you would imagine you would start thinking about the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem. But I happened to be there in February 2022. I was invited by someone to go to a lecture there, where one of the Franciscans from Jerusalem was presenting the Latin treasure, the objects in this exhibition, to a Parisian audience and explaining about the building of a museum in Jerusalem that I will talk about in a second. And I was very interested in this, and by the end of the lecture I introduced myself to this Franciscan friar and asked a apparently simple question: have you ever considered sending these objects to New York? Fast forward 2 months, I'm in Jerusalem, and in May of 2022, I had been in Jerusalem before, but I traveled there especially to discuss this possibility with the Franciscans and look at the objects in the flesh. I had never seen many of these objects before, most of them, to be honest. And here, of course, is Jerusalem seen from the Mount of Olives, with the esplanade of the temple, the Dome of the Rock, and in the very, very background you can see another great dome, and that is the Dome of the Holy Sepulcher. Now, as I was there, I saw some of these objects in situ, and this is the great relief of the Resurrection, which you will have seen upstairs in the first room. This usually hangs in one of the chapels at the Sepulchre. Here it is hanging there, a little tarnished before we cleaned it. But most of the other objects were actually hidden away in the monastery of the Franciscans, kept for safekeeping in sacristies and storage in a number of different locations. So I was there in Jerusalem with my two co-curators for the exhibition, Benoit Constançou, who you see here on the left, handling the incredible Napolitan monstrance, and Jacques-Charles Gaffiot. And with the friars, this on the right is one of them, Fra Rodrigo, with a silver 19th century lamp that was donated by the Savoia family, the Italian royal family, which is not in the show because it falls outside the chronological scope of the show. But just to give you a sense of how those early days in Jerusalem shaped the show by looking at as many objects as possible and bringing them out and studying them. Most of these objects are in the show, plus others. There are some things here that actually didn't make it to the show, but just trying to work out with the Franciscans, with the other curators. And what I can say is that the amount of objects there is truly staggering. So choosing the right things and making the selection was a wonderful challenge to have. The Holy Sepulcher, of course, is the key site that we're looking at, and it is directly linked to the Franciscans and to what is known as the Custodia di Terra Santa, the custody of the Holy Land, an institution that was created in the 14th century by the Pope in Rome, where he entrusted the Franciscans with the custody, the taking care of all of the holy sites from southern Turkey to Egypt, across the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, into Egypt, and even Cyprus. There are about 55 sites that they take care of, but none of them more important than the Holy Sepulcher, which is in itself a church that over the centuries has changed a number of times and is visible today in a much transformed way from the beginning. The church is represented in the show by this model made in the 18th century in Bethlehem. And this, you have to imagine, is a way in which the Franciscans would have sent images of the Holy Sepulchre to an audience in Europe at a time in the 17th and 18th century when it was quite difficult for people to travel to the Holy Land. So if you cannot go to the Holy Land, here's part of the Holy Land coming to you. And of course, this object made of pistachio wood, camel bone, and mother of pearl would have been a very precious gift. This wouldn't have been for any odd person that desired to go to Jerusalem. This would have been for a royal, for a member of a royal family or an important ambassador. Now, when you arrive at the Holy Sepulchre, you enter a site which has been the site of pilgrimage for thousands of years, for 2,000 years. And one of the most touching things I find in the church is the inscriptions of crosses throughout the walls of the church. You see a couple of examples here, which were done by pilgrims over a long period of time. So some of these things may date back to the Crusaders' time or even before that. And here on the right, you see one of the friars. This is actually an American friar, Friar Jordan, welcoming people at the door of the sepulchre. And of course, one of the big jobs of the Franciscans is to welcome pilgrims on the site. And again, in the 17th and 18th century, that was somewhat difficult because the land, the area was under Muslim rule, under the Ottoman rule. And of course, bribes and money had to be paid to have access to the Holy Sepulchre and worship there. And the Franciscans were the sort of conduct through which this would happen. The site of the Holy Sepulchre is an ancient site that is said to be the place where Christ was crucified, died, buried, and resurrected. So all of the passion and resurrection of Christ happened on the site. I've been asked a number of times, is it really the place? I can't tell you, I wasn't there when it happened, but what I can say is that it was a site that was already a site of Christian worship in the 1st century. So we're talking very early on. So the likelihood that it is connected in some way to the story of Christ is there. It's then rebuilt a number of times, and the Emperor Hadrian builds a pagan temple over the site to erase the Christian worship there, even though it kind of carries on. And this is the first big basilica reconstruction of it, which is built in the 4th century between 326 and 335 AD by the Emperor Constantine, who makes Christianity a legal religion in the Roman Empire. It was illegal until then, hence persecutions and all of that. And what you see from these reconstructions, a plan and a section, is how large this complex was and how unusual it was. Because it was commemorating a number of different sites, it was built around them. And you see that there was an atrium, a sort of entrance space, then a basilica, which is really a sort of church-like space as we think of one. But beyond that, there were the two most important sites. So there was an open courtyard with a hill in it, in the corner, which is Calvary, and Calvary is the hill on which the crucifixion supposedly took place, and then a rotunda built around the tomb where the resurrection is supposed to have taken place. Now, it's important to look at this because we will see in a second how the current structure is still somewhat based in parts on this early plan, even though it is a smaller church, it's shorter, so a lot of the atrium and the basilica have been lost over the centuries. The church, as you see it today, is pretty much a Crusader church. So the Christian period in Jerusalem goes from 1099, the Christian victory at the First Crusade, Geoffrey of Bouillon conquering Jerusalem in 1099, to 1187, which is when the Muslims, the Mamluks, with Saladin, conquer Jerusalem again and becomes an Islamic city all the way till the 20th century. So in this window, 1099 to 1187, is when most of the structure of the Holy Sepulchre, as we know it today, was built. Here you see some of that Crusader structure, but in fact, much altered in the 19th century and over a period of time. And here you see the church as it is today. And what is important to understand here is that, of course, during the Crusaders' time, there was only one Christian community. There was no division within the Christian church. So there was a patriarch, a Christian patriarch. The Christians were all one sort of happy family, let's say. While, of course, by the 17th, 18th century, and even today, there is a big division between different denominations. So Greek Orthodox, Latins, which are basically Roman Catholics, And they all are Armenians and so on, and they divide the church geographically. So you can see that the largest real estate, the light blue, is the Greeks, the Greek Orthodox. Then there are the purple, which are the Latins, the Roman Catholic, followed by the yellow, the Armenians. And those are the three main denominations. Then there are the Copts, the red, and the Syrians in light green, who have one very small space. It looks like the Ethiopians in orange have a very large space, but that is the roof of the church. So they are outside the church. And the idea of how close you can be to the tomb of Christ is very important. And so certain denominations like the Ethiopians prefer to be even outside on the roof than not to have a presence there. So that is an interesting thing. You see also how certain areas, so for example, the area at the bottom divided between light blue and purple is actually Calvary. I'll show you that in a second. And you see that there are staircases because it's higher inside the church, and half of it is Catholic, half of it is Greek. But other areas, the entrance square, the parvis, the area around the stone of unction, and the rotunda and the tomb itself are actually gray areas that are shared by everyone, don't belong to anyone. And so how you use those spaces is a very important issue. In the 19th century, a set of rules is established, known as the status quo, which determines who does what, when, and how within the Holy Sepulchre. And everyone has abided to those rules to this day. And it is a very curious set of rules, which has some very strange side effects, including this famous ladder that hangs outside one of the windows, that because no one knows who put it there, what is it for, has remained there since the 19th century and no one can move it. It's actually part of the status quo that no one can ever touch the ladder. It was actually stolen a few years ago, and there was a big drama in Jerusalem over the theft of the ladder, and it miraculously reappeared. So whoever stole it did return it, and it's back where it was. But again, the idea of status quo, that nothing can change, is very much ingrained. So if you go today to the Holy Sepulchre, the ceremonies you're witnessing are basically the same that people had witnessed 100, 200 years ago, even longer, that are inset in the set of regulations. The other thing to mention is that when you look at the plan, you think the Holy Sepulchre is, a flat structure. In fact, it's a very three-dimensional structure. There are ups and downs in the church. So Calvary is at a higher level than the tomb and everything else. So this is the staircase, one of the two staircases going up to Calvary. And you have to imagine that when you are in the church, it's a bit of a labyrinth, and you have to understand where you are. And there's a lot of going up and going down. And even the tomb, you have to imagine originally would have been in a cliff, in a hill, and Constantine digs around this cliff to create the rotunda around it. So when you're in the rotunda, you're on a ground floor, you're on ground level, but the loggia at the back, outside, is ground level there. So you're sort of in an excavated area. So there is a number, and that has an effect on how the space is used, obviously. So to give you an example, this is Calvary, and this is supposed to be the actual site where the crucifixion took place. Through that glass, you see a rock, which is supposed to be the rock where Christ was crucified. There is actually even a hole there that supposedly is the hole where the cross was put in. And this belongs to the Greeks. But immediately to the right, there is the Latin Calvary. And so this is the Catholic chapel with early mosaics that were unfortunately much restored later on, and an altar which was a gift of the Medici family in the 16th century for the Franciscans to use. And so you can imagine how these two spaces are used by the Greeks and the Latins, sometimes even, as we'll see in a second, at the same time. Of course, the central part is the rotunda with the tomb, and as I explained, you see there the upper level, the upper loggia, and you have to imagine that on the right at the back, that is the ground level, while on the left, you are on the ground level on that side. So all of this was excavated by Constantine and then kept that way. And what becomes very important in the liturgy, which I will show you in a second, is the processing around the tomb. The tomb itself is tiny. You have to crawl in, and 2, maybe 3 people can fit in at one time. So obviously it's not something that the masses can get in very easily into, and there's often a very long line to wait to get in. But the idea of going around the tomb becomes a very important issue for using this space. So that's to give you a sense of the space. But going back to the preparation for the show, after May 22 and the time spent there selecting the objects, I returned with a Frick team in July 23 to work on the objects. And so there I am with one of our conservators, preparators, cleaning bits of the huge torchères you see upstairs. We actually spent 2 weeks cleaning them, and I became a temporary conservator. I became very good at polishing silver. And on the left, you see actually some of the Franciscans. And it was a really wonderful moment where our conservators taught the Franciscans how to take care of these objects and how to polish silver properly. And there was a whole back and forth discussion on how to do that. And at the same time, we photographed all the objects in very perilous conditions. There is no photographic studio at the Holy Sepulcher or at the Franciscans' monastery. So there we are in very makeshift spaces trying to take photos. The space on the right is part of the sacristy of the Franciscans, and we literally had to climb on these balconies to be able to take photos. It was the only space that was large enough to show these wonderful copes, opened up, full space. And so this is the Genoese one that is also, both of these objects are in the exhibition, the Spanish dalmatic and the Genoese cope. What needs to be said from the start is that, of course, the Holy Sepulchre is a place of faith. And so all of the objects that we're looking at in the exhibition, we have to imagine and understand were used, are still used to some degree. And I will talk a little bit about specific examples of that. But I want to fast forward again to April of this year, to Easter of this year, when I did travel to Jerusalem again for the last time. And I'm going to share with you a number of videos and images from that time to make you understand and walk you through Holy Week at the Sepulchre, also to understand how some of the objects are used. Now, we begin outside the Holy Sepulchre again. We go out into the square, because one of the key traditions is the traditions of the doors. Now, when Saladin arrives in Jerusalem in 1187, he decides that Christians can worship at the Sepulchre, but it needs to be controlled, and it needs to provide funds for the Muslims, for the Mamelukes at that point, and later the Ottomans. So you see on the right, the wall on the right is a door, a Crusader door that was actually locked up, was walled up. And several other doors were walled up. And to this day, the only entrance and exit to the Sepulchre is the door you see here. The man you see on the right is Adib Judeh al-Husseini, and he is the man who owns the keys to the Holy Sepulchre, and he is a direct descendant of the person who got the keys in 1187. So when we're talking about traditions, we're talking about serious traditions. So son after son in this family have passed this tradition of having the keys and opening and closing the doors. And opening and closing the doors is a huge production every morning and evening, and during Holy Weeks, several times a day. And so I'm going to show you here the doors being closed from the outside. And of course, there are two levels. So at the upper level, you have to lock it with this ladder, which is not the ladder that it's up near the window. It's a different ladder. And then once that is done, you can go down and close the other one. And you see that the holder of the keys is below, but it's a great honor to invite someone to do the opening and closing so that it's not always him doing it. And you can see here that the ladder is then put through a hole through the door and goes back inside the church. So opening and closing the door is actually a partnership between who is locked inside and who is outside, because you cannot open it outside unless someone from inside passes the ladder. This is closed and open every day. During COVID, it was closed for weeks and months. And during that time, the people who were inside the church were locked inside the church for weeks and months. And so this is the only access for opening, closing, and food. From the inside, I was lucky enough to be there a number of times and to be locked in. And this is what it feels like on the opposite side. And here you see two Franciscans and a Greek priest. There's also an Armenian. an Armenian, a Greek, and a Latin all have to be present at the closing or opening of the door. You cannot open or close them without the three of them present inside. So this is one of the many traditions. The other one is the kawas. And the kawas are, again, an old tradition back to Ottoman times, where a kawas is a bodyguard, a guard of honor for usually ambassadors, consuls, or important people in the Muslim world. And the Christians were allowed to have their own kawas. So the Catholics have 4 kawas, the Greeks have 4, and then everyone else has 2, the Armenians, the Copts, and so on. And here you see the kawas with the Catholics at different points, and you'll see them over and over again in some of the videos that I will show you. They wear these very distinctive fez, and they have these sort of maces, these batons, and they have weapons, they have swords, and they're meant to be bodyguards for in this case, the Catholics. They have slightly different uniforms if they're guarding the Catholics, the Greeks, or the Armenians. And of course, originally they were Muslim, so there were Muslim guards for the Christians. Of course, today that's not necessarily the case anymore. Some of them are Christian themselves, or even other religions, they're not necessarily Muslim. What is important to understand within the sepulchre is the importance of movement. And when you think especially of the vestments, how these objects are used by priests, friars, whoever it is, using the space. And needless to say, they're used in very different ways. So the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Catholics use the same space with very different ceremonies and different moments. So I'm going to start with the Greeks, and the Greeks have this tradition of incensing the holy sites several times a day. So you would see them going around the church with their incense burners, worshipping at different sites in a very beautiful choreographed sort of dance almost. And this is a group of Greek priests incensing the stone of unction, which is the stone on which Christ's body was placed and covered in oil and fragrant things before he was buried in the tomb. And of course, at the top is Calvary. So you see the level difference in the church. And of course, now they're going up to Calvary to do the same thing up there. In the meantime, outside the church, this is what the Armenians are doing. And of course, the Catholics have several processions on a daily basis within the church. There's a very important one every afternoon. And here you have the one during Holy Week, the same regular procession that happens every day, but in this case with the Patriarch, who is the man dressed in red. So one note as well about the Patriarch that is worth pointing out, and this again gets into the nitty-gritties of the complications of the Holy Sepulchre. Of course, during the Latin period of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century, there was one Patriarch of Jerusalem. Of course, by the time you fast forward through the Reformation and the division, the schism between Greek Orthodox and Latins, there is a Greek patriarch who still claims to be the Patriarch of Jerusalem, but the Latins, through most of the early modern period, don't have a patriarch. What they have is the head of the custodia, the custos, who is a Franciscan, is always Italian, and basically acts as a bishop of Jerusalem. So everything you see in the exhibition upstairs in the 17th and 18th century is used mostly by the custos, who has a crozier and a mitre and all the accoutrements that you would have for a bishop. To make things a little exciting, in 1847, the Pope decides to reinstate the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So currently there is a patriarch and a custos, and they basically have the same role, which means that they can never be at the Holy Sepulchre at the same time, because if they are at the same time, it creates a nightmare in terms of diplomacy, and the Greeks don't recognize, or the Armenians don't recognize the Latin patriarch. They think he's a fake patriarch, so they only recognize the custos. So the patriarch can go at Easter as the representative of the custos, so it's a little complicated, and so who is in the church at what time for the Latins becomes quite interesting during Holy Week, and you'll see both of them in some of the images I will show you. A patriarch is basically a bishop, and there are 5 patriarchs in the Catholic Church. There's the Patriarch of the West, which is basically the Pope in Rome, even though he's not referred to as Patriarch. Then there is the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Patriarch of the East Indies in Goa, and then the only 2 European patriarchs are the Patriarchs of Venice and of Lisbon. And they're basically high-ranking bishops, but they go, for a number of reasons, under the name of patriarchs. So when we get to Holy Week in Jerusalem, we start with Palm Sunday. And so I'm going to start by showing you the procession at Palm Sunday with the patriarch around the tomb. The processions, depending on how important they are, they go around the tombs a number of times. So the most important processions, you go around the tomb 3 times. But sometimes it's once, sometimes it's twice. And obviously in all these grand festivities like Palm Sunday, it's 3 times. What happens when these processions take place and these events take place is that there can be different processions and different activities happening at the same time. That's where the status quo comes in and why it's so complicated, because it's not like one denomination has access to the church for themselves at one point. So it gets very noisy, it gets very complicated. The Catholics joke that they have the secret weapon, which is the organ, which drowns everybody else's voice and chanting. But it's not a normal church. So what you would imagine in a regular church is that there is a high altar with an altar. But at the tomb, there is no altar. So you have to make up an altar every time. So this is around sort of Easter week. It's a setup that is put in front of the tomb for the Catholics to celebrate. What happens is that that altar has to be assembled and dismantled very quickly, because within the next half hour, the Greeks are building their altar there, and then the Armenians. So this is, again, one of the processions during Holy Week, and I'll show you 2 videos where you see the Patriarch processing under the canopy with a number of priests, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, all of that. And as they're finishing the last round, the altar is being dismantled. procession is still taking place at the back, as everything has to be removed in time for the procession to finish, and in this case, for the Greeks to arrive. By the way, that altar frontal is about 1,600 from the roof. And this is how the objects are used at the Holy Sepulchre. Everything has to be removed. And of course, by the end of Holy Week, I became an expert in this and actually did help moving several altars and giving a hand removing flowers and candles. But this is to give you a sense that this is an extraordinary place. This doesn't happen in any other church in the world. You don't have places where different parts of the same religion share a space and have to cohabit in this way. One of the most misunderstood things about the Holy Sepulchre is this idea that it's this incredibly beautiful contemplative place where you sort of can communicate with God in a very peaceful way. The place is actually pretty much like Penn Station. So these are Syrian, Aramaic. They're people who spoke the language that Jesus spoke. So they're Christian Syrians. And these are, during Holy Week, worshipping at the sepulchre. But this is not what you would expect, usually in a church. I have absolutely no idea what they're saying, but Jesus would have understood what they're saying. That was the language Jesus spoke. Now, this is never more true than on the key festivity at the Sepulchre, which is a festivity that actually does not involve the Latin Church, and it's the Holy Fire, which happens every year on Saturday before Easter. This year, Easter, Greek Easter and Latin Easter coincided, which happens usually every 4 years. And I was lucky enough to witness this, because the entire old city of Jerusalem is blocked off by Israeli police. They don't allow anyone into the city unless you're Greek Orthodox. And there are so many people, hundreds of thousands of people that go to the church, around the church, outside in the old city to get some of this holy fire. That is actually very difficult for other people to get in there. Now, I slept in the church during the night before with the Franciscans, and so I was already in the church by Saturday and I could witness the whole thing. And it was a pretty remarkable experience. Now, this is a miracle for the Greek Orthodox Church. It's recognized by the Armenians and the Copts and the Syrians and everyone else. Is not recognized by the Latins, which is why the Latins have nothing to do with Holy Fire and are very skeptical of it. But the idea is that the tomb is sealed the morning of Saturday by Israeli police, Armenians, Copts, Syrians, everyone else, not the Catholics. They put seals on the door. They check that the tomb is entirely empty. And in the afternoon, after the crowds gather inside the church, the Greek patriarch processes around the church, around the tomb 3 times, and then strips down to just a simple shirt and goes in the tomb, breaks the seals by himself, locks himself in the tomb with candles that miraculously light inside the tomb with no source of fire. So it's supposed to be a miracle. You know, how this actually happens, there's been endless discussions of what the trick may or may not be. But the fire is then passed out through holes in the side of the tomb to everyone in the church, first to the Greek patriarch, who's at the top where that weird flag is, and then to everyone else in the church. And people keep this fire alive in their homes for months, for years. It's considered a very holy thing to have. And this is the moment leading to it. So you see that there's someone at the hole in the side, there's another person on the other side, who are waiting for the fire to be passed from inside the tomb. as the fire is passed throughout the church, this is what the church starts looking like. And this is what it looks like after the fire is put out. But you have to remember there's one door, one entrance, one exit. The Catholics always joke that the real miracle is that the place has never been set on fire through the ceremony and that no one ever gets hurt. But it's, you know, it's a pretty scary position to be in because you are locked inside this place with a lot of fire in a very small place. So this is, again, one of the ceremonies that doesn't affect what is in our exhibition because we don't have any Greek objects in the exhibition, but to give you a sense of the different types of things that happen at the Holy Sepulcher. And now to focus on more precisely objects in the exhibition, this is a very bad photo of Maundy Thursday, where, of course, there is the reenactment of the Last Supper and the washing of the feet, which is something that Christ did at the Last Supper, and of course priests, bishops, the Pope himself reenact this every Maundy Thursday. In the old tradition, people going to the Holy Sepulchre, arriving as pilgrims in the 17th and 18th century, they would have their feet washed upon arrival because most of the time they traveled from a long time, long distance, and you know it was just a practical thing to wash your feet once you had walked through the desert for a very long time. Now, of course, it only happens on Maundy Thursday, and this is the patriarch washing the feet of some of the priests. He also washes the feet of some of the pilgrims and some of the friars. But this basin in the exhibition is used for that ceremony. So this is a basin, a silver basin created in 1673, and it was a gift of the future king of Portugal, Peter II, to the Holy Sepulchre, designed to do this. So from 1673 until today, this object is regularly used every Maundy Thursday at the Basilica for the washing of the feet. The same is true of these vestments and objects which are used the next day on Good Friday at Calvary. And there's a very peculiar ceremony that takes place, in this case enacted by the Custos, not by the Patriarch. And it's the so-called funeral of Christ. So it's the day Christ died, in theory, and so what they do is there is a reenactment of the funeral of Christ. There is actually a doll-like crucifix that gets brought from Calvary down. The statue is taken off the cross, the arms go down, it's a sort of doll, effectively, and it gets carried first to the stone of unction, where it is covered in precious oil and incense and a number of things, and then carried into the tomb. And this is followed by a huge crowd. The vestments you see here were important gifts. We'll see them in a second. And you see the silver object there that we'll talk about in a second as well. And here is the Custos anointing the body of Christ over the stone of unction on Good Friday. And you can see that the vessel is used and the vestments they're using. And the silver objects are a combination of European objects, the larger ones, which are German and Polish from the 17th century. And the perfume bottles are actually Muslim objects, Islamic objects that are used for this. The vestments are gifts. The coat of arms is the royal coat of arms of Spain, and the gifts of Isabel II, the Queen of Spain in the 19th century, and they're still used for the ceremony. But in the exhibition, you have these two vestments, the one on the left from Milan, 1600, and the one on the right, a Spanish one, which was a gift of Ferdinand VI between the late 1750s, early 1760s. And these were both also used for that ceremony, for the funeral of Christ. The ones on the left, that set of vestments has symbols of the Passion of Christ. The one on the right, when you see it in the exhibition, you see it with the coat of arms of Spain. On the opposite side, which unfortunately you cannot see in the exhibition, there are scenes of the Passion of Christ, like the crucifixion. These vestments were originally black and gold, and in 1885, the Franciscans sent them to Valencia in Spain to be reapplied on a different fabric. And so from black, they became white, which means that they're now used for Easter and not for Good Friday. But to give you a sense of how these objects were used in these ceremonies that still take place. And of course, the resurrection, Easter Sunday, is the feast of Christianity, and it's the feast that they celebrate in Jerusalem. And of course, that is the grandest event that takes place at the Sepulchre. This is the great relief that I showed you at the beginning, made in Naples in 1736, which is on view at the Sepulchre most of the time, and of course reminds pilgrims and people of the key event, because of which the church was built. So this is Easter Sunday at the Sepulchre. And notice the three men behind the patriarch here with the candles. So those three men are the consuls of France, Spain, and Italy in Jerusalem. So to this day, there is a presence of the most Catholic countries in Europe behind the Patriarch at Easter at the Sepulchre. They're invited, they preside over the ceremony. And this, of course, brings us to the core of the exhibition, which is the gifts of European monarchs to the Sepulchre. So what you have to imagine is that clearly none of the kings that I will show you over the next 5 minutes ever had any possibility of making it to Jerusalem and witnessing what I've showed you. But the ceremonies at the time would have been very similar. The liturgy of Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, Palm Sunday would have been very, very similar. Of course, with probably fewer pilgrims in the 17th and 18th century. But because these monarchs couldn't make it themselves to Jerusalem, they sent almost as a sort of proxy gift these precious objects from themselves and from their states, the states they governed, as a gift to the Franciscans. So here you see from the exhibition the incredible set of vestments in silver sent by Louis XIII between 1615 and 1625. And you see a portrait of the king on the left. Clearly, he had a passion for fleur-de-lis, in case you had any doubt he was French. And, it's a pretty good indication that these objects came from France. So, you can imagine that today the consul of France still, in a way, represents France at this ceremony at Easter at the Sepulchre. Interestingly enough, these vestments also had a change of fabric in the 19th century. We know from documents that when they were sent to the Sepulchre, they were white and gold, which means that they were used for Easter. They were subsequently changed to red vestments, which means they're used for Palm Sunday or Pentecost or a number of other festivities. So they're sort of a little less important than what you would use for Easter. So they were downgraded by the change of color, but originally the king would have sent something to be used for Easter Sunday. For us, more importantly, our friend Philip IV in the Velázquez portrait sent this incredible tabernacle, which is created in Messina in Sicily, part of the Spanish states at the time, between 1665 and 1666, around the time the king dies. So it is inscribed with the king's name, it has the king's coat of arms, but we know it reaches Jerusalem at a point in 66 when the king is already dead. And the rest of the altar you will see upstairs, the candles and flowers, were all continued as a commission by the king's son, Charles II, who then subsequently sends them to Jerusalem. So I think it's interesting for us, we think so much about painting as a great great work of art, so something like this Velázquez, but it's worth thinking that the king paid a lot more for the silver throne of exposition sent to Jerusalem than he ever paid for a Velázquez portrait. So within the scheme of things, portraits like this were fairly cheap for a royal commission, while something silver and gold like these objects would have been the high end of what the king would have paid for. And remaining in the Spanish world, the last important patron is Charles III of Naples, and he sent a series of gifts from Naples between 1746 and 1756 over a period of 10 years. And these are the great gold objects, the great monstrance that you see in the exhibition upstairs in gold with rubies, diamonds, and emeralds. And, of course, the great crozier. And you can now imagine how these objects would have been used. You've just seen the patriarch with a crozier walking around the tomb at Easter. This is exactly what the crozier was used for and still occasionally is used for. I'm not entirely sure when this was last used. I haven't asked the Franciscans, but I'm sure it was fairly recently. And, of course, with papal visits and events of that kind, these objects are used and taken out. and the incredible throne of exposition, which you can imagine would have been placed in front of the tomb or in other places at the sepulchre in Jerusalem to display the monstrance and the host, again, only on very special occasions and special feasts. I keep saying these objects are used, but they're not by all means used on a daily basis. I mean, these are things that are used once a year, maybe even less than that. And so they're all very extraordinary objects, and that's why they were preserved, because it's not so much the daily usage, but it's the extraordinary usage and preservation because of the usage occasionally every year. The silver lamp is a gift of the same king, and I think in the exhibition, apart from Louis XIII, Charles III is the one that commissioned most of the objects in the show. So he first commissions the gold objects as King of Naples, but in 1786 he sends this lamp by the time he's become King of Spain. So he gives up the throne of Naples to move to Spain. And so you have different objects commissioned in Naples and in Madrid by the same king for the same site. And in the exhibition, you will have seen a number of lamps. There's this lamp, there is a lamp of Louis XIII, and there are the two lamps of João V of Portugal and Charles VI of Austria, the emperor. And, you know, why are lamps so important? Because, in fact, there are lamps everywhere in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So here you see the exterior with a number of lamps above it. And all of the lamps inside and around the tomb, again, are shared. You have the Latin lamps, the Greek lamps, the Armenian lamps, and each one of those denominations take care of their own lamps. These are two photos inside the tomb. Very difficult to take photos because you're in a very, very small space. But you can see that the entire ceiling of the tomb is filled with lamps. Some of these 17th, 18th century, some of them Latin, some of them from other countries. And many of these objects have hidden in a way in plain sight. You know, most people who make it inside the tomb are not really looking at lamps. And so, you know, some of these objects were rediscovered in a way by art historians fairly recently because, again, they're still used in this site. So when you get into the exhibition, I hope that everyone will have, if not the feeling of being in Jerusalem, as close as possible as one can recreate in exhibition galleries on Fifth Avenue in New York. But my intention was to try and give some of the light that you experience in the Holy Sepulchre. And the colors, the pink and the yellow, are colors that are the colors of the stones of Jerusalem, which are a very strange mix between pink and yellow. And so everything within the church is this sort of strange color. And of course, nothing in the church would be displayed this way. But this is to say that these objects, which are part of usage to this day, now have a very different future, because through their discovery by art historians, museum people, academics, the Franciscans have begun to understand the historical value of these objects, not just as something you use for Easter or Good Friday, but as something that should be preserved as works of art. And the thin line between works of art and practical objects is a very interesting one, and one that has guaranteed the survival of these objects, but also makes their future somewhat complicated. So the Franciscans have decided to build a museum in Jerusalem within the footprint of their monastery, which is only about 2-3 minute walk from the Holy Sepulchre. And in it, they will display most of these objects, with the idea that still from the museum, they can be taken out for special occasions and be used in the church and then brought back to the museum. How often that will happen is to be debated. Some of the Franciscans, of course, feel very strongly about using some of these objects. Others feel that they can be replaced with less valuable, more modern objects, and the liturgy would still be the same. But as you've seen from the images, they're still using some of these objects now. I mean, they used them in April this year. So, the tradition continues, and I think it is important to think about these objects as works from the past, but at the same time as living objects that have a life in the present. And whatever their future may be, they will hopefully in some way still be present as part of the life and liturgy and faith in Jerusalem. This, I think, becomes a very interesting question for any of us working in a museum. In a museum, in a way, the objects become a very different thing. We forget how pretty much everything in a museum at some point or another was used by people and was in people's homes, in churches, in villas, in a number of other locations. But once they enter a museum, they become these sort of untouchable, admirable works. But these things are still, used and knocked about and moved quickly within a church. And to me, that is fascinating. So I hope with this lecture to have given you a bit of a sense of that, and I hope that you will all enjoy the exhibition and enjoy the objects and maybe see them in a slightly different way after this lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.